Ladies and gentlemen, let me take you back to a moment in time. A cold, silent morning in February. It was 4:03 a.m. I was sitting alone in my kitchen, clutching a cup of coffee that was too hot to drink, staring into nothing, and asking myself a question I hadn't dared to ask in years. Why do I feel more alive right now than I do at 2 p.m. on most days? Outside, the world was still. It was the kind of stillness that doesn't just surround you, it enters you. No notifications, no emails, no demands, no noise. Just a kind of sacred solitude. That was the first time I realized that waking up at 4 a.m. wasn't about productivity. It was about peace. It wasn't about hustle. It was about clarity. And over time, I began to notice a pattern not in my schedule, but in my mind. You see, in the early hours of the morning, when the world is still asleep, your brain is in a different state. This isn't just poetic, it's physiological. Neuroscience tells us that in the early morning hours, especially between 4 and 6 a.m., our brains are rich in a chemical called dopamine, the neurotransmitter of motivation, of attention, of drive. But more interestingly, cortisol, the stress hormone, begins to rise just enough to help you wake up, not spike like it does later in the day when you're hit with meetings, traffic, and news cycles, but gently. This combination of increased dopamine and controlled cortisol creates a biochemical window of deep mental clarity. And that clarity, ladies and gentlemen, is where breakthroughs are born. Some of the greatest minds, artists, and leaders in history were early risers not because it made them look disciplined, but because they had discovered, often by accident, the rare mental terrain available before the world wakes. Ernest Hemingway famously wrote at dawn. He said the words came easier then. Benjamin Franklin started each day by asking, "What good shall I do this day?" Long before email, Franklin had already built a system that recognized the morning as sacred territory. But let me tell you something I've learned through both science and personal struggle. The real benefit of waking up at 4 a.m. is not about getting a head start on your to-do list. It's about remembering who you are before the world tells you who to be. That's a hard thing to hear, especially in an age where everyone is screaming for your attention, where your day begins not with intention, but with reaction. The first ping on your phone, the first headline, the first obligation. But if you can take the first hour of your day, the quiet, unclaimed hour, and make it yours, you change the rhythm of your life. And rhythm is everything. The human brain is wired to work in rhythms, circadian rhythms, ultradian rhythms, the rhythm of breath, of sleep, of thought. When we wake up reacting to the world, we break the rhythm. When we wake up with intention, we restore it. Now let's get something straight. This isn't about perfection. You don't wake up at 4 a.m. and suddenly become a superhero. You'll still have bad days, you'll still get tired, but what changes is the foundation. You stop building your life on sand and you begin to build it on bedrock. There's a term in neuroscience called neuroplasticity. It means the brain is malleable, it changes constantly. Every experience, every thought, every habit shapes its structure. When you consistently wake up early before the chaos, you are carving new pathways in the brain. You are reinforcing delayed gratification. You're strengthening prefrontal cortex control, the seat of decision, making, empathy, and focus. But even beyond the brain, something else happens. You start to hear your own voice again. I had a client once, a CEO of a fast, growing tech company, brilliant, sharp, always on. But she came to me in a quiet panic. "I don't know what I believe anymore," she said. "Every day is just noise." I told her to wake up at 4 a.m. That's it, nothing else. I said, don't check your phone, don't open your laptop. Just sit, or read, or write. Or walk. 2 months later, she walked into my office, dropped her phone on the desk, and said, "I've got it. I remember who I am." That's the power of intentional solitude. And 4 a.m. is solitude in its purest form. There's something deeply primal about waking up in darkness. For most of human history, we rose and slept with the sun. But waking before the sun isn't unnatural. In fact, it's when some of our oldest internal processes come online. The pineal gland, for instance, a tiny, pea-shaped structure deep in the brain, secretes melatonin in response to darkness. But as dawn approaches, melatonin drops and serotonin rises, the precursor to happiness, calm, and alertness. This hormonal shift is gentle, graceful, and biologically designed, but most of us sleep through that moment. We miss the chance to feel our chemistry align with the Earth's, and when we miss that too often, we begin to feel, though we can't name it, out of sync. Waking up at 4 a.m. is a return to sync. It's not about being better than anyone else. It's not about proving your worth. It's about reclaiming your rhythm in a world that profits off your distraction. Now, let's talk about distraction. Because it's not just an inconvenience, it's a neurological hijack. When we wake up and immediately enter a state of reactivity, when we check notifications, open emails, scroll through headlines, our brains go into what's called task mode. We activate the salience network, which is great for identifying urgent information, but terrible for long-term creativity or problem solving. You become good at reacting, but bad at thinking, good at doing, but bad at being. But at 4 a.m., before the pings and the tasks and the noise, something extraordinary happens. The default mode network, the part of the brain associated with introspection, memory consolidation, self-awareness, becomes dominant. That's the space where creativity lives. That's where insight happens, not in the chaos, in the quiet. When you wake at 4 a.m. and give yourself even 30 minutes of stillness, you're giving your brain a chance to connect dots it can't connect in the noise. That's not motivation, that's not philosophy, that's biology. Now, I want to be honest with you. Waking up at 4 a.m. is not easy. It never becomes easy, and maybe it shouldn't. Because everything meaningful in life comes with a little friction. Falling in love, starting a business, becoming a parent, creating something real. These things ask something of us. So does this, but here's the beautiful part. The difficulty is the point. The discipline becomes the doorway. Each time you choose to get up early, you reinforce a message to yourself, not just that you're in control, but that you are worth prioritizing. That your inner world deserves to be heard before the outer world starts yelling. Over time, that message becomes a belief. That belief becomes an identity, and identity, not habit, is what changes behavior. You don't wake up early because you're trying to be more productive. You wake up early because that's who you are now. A person who honors their own mind, and once that shift happens, everything else changes. You start the day with intention, not reaction. You show up to meetings already grounded. You handle stress better. You make clearer decisions. You connect more deeply because you're not carrying the residue of chaos into every interaction. You stop chasing alignment and start living from it. It's not magic, it's neuroscience, and it's available to every single one of us. I remember a man I met during a retreat I led in the Alps. Former Navy officer, now a high-level executive. He had spent years in war zones and boardrooms, trained in intensity, but burned out. He told me he'd tried everything: mindfulness apps, supplements, therapy. Nothing stuck. Until one morning, jet-lagged and unable to sleep, he got out of bed at 4 a.m., wrapped himself in a blanket, and just sat by the window watching the mountains breathe. He told me it was the first time in years he didn't feel at war with the world or with himself. That's what I'm talking about. That's what's available. We're not just tired because we work too much. We're tired because we never start the day with ourselves. We are never alone long enough to listen to what we truly need, and that absence, that disconnection, is what drains us. Not work, not effort, disconnection. So we chase more goals, more hacks, more dopamine, hoping to fill a space that's asking not for more, but for stillness. At 4 a.m. there is stillness. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to meditate for 10 years to feel it. You just have to be awake and willing. And let me say this clearly. This is not about waking up early to suffer. This is about waking up early to remember that your life is not just a calendar, to remember that clarity is not found in more information, but in less noise. To remember that you are not behind, you are just overwhelmed by inputs. And if you could step outside that input stream, even for an hour every day, you'd be amazed what you already know. You'd be amazed at how your own wisdom, the kind buried under layers of urgency, begins to rise. That's what 4 a.m. gives you. Not a schedule, but a signal that says, this day is yours, this life is yours, and you don't need to wait for permission to live it differently. Let me tell you what begins to happen when that signal becomes your ritual. Over time, your nervous system adjusts. The autonomic nervous system, the part of your body that regulates stress and recovery, begins to anticipate the shift. Your parasympathetic system, the one responsible for calm and restoration, gets stronger in the morning hours. You don't just wake up at 4 a.m. You start rising at 4 a.m. There's a difference. Rising is an act of intention. Waking is just a biological function, and when your intention is strong enough, your biology follows. What we often forget is that our biology isn't separate from our psychology. It's not mind over matter. It's mind and matter in collaboration. When you consistently show up for yourself before the world wakes up, your body, your hormones, your neurotransmitters, even your immune system, they begin to align with your behavior. It becomes easier, not because the task changes, but because you do. And that, my friends, is the essence of growth. Not in trying to control the world, but in learning to master your own state consistently. We often talk about confidence, but we don't talk enough about where it actually comes from. Confidence is not the result of achievement. That's a myth. Confidence is the result of consistency. It's what happens when you keep a promise to yourself again and again. When you become someone who does what they say they'll do, even when it's hard, even when it's early, even when no one is watching. Especially when no one is watching. That's why 4 a.m. is powerful. No audience, no applause, no algorithm. Just you showing up. And isn't that the kind of leadership we all crave? Not the kind that performs, the kind that grounds. The kind that begins from within, not from attention. I've worked with Olympic athletes, combat veterans, trauma survivors, and C-suite executives. And the one thing they all have in common, the truly resilient ones, is that they don't wait for the world to give them permission to be who they are. They create space to listen to who they are. And for many of them, that space is the early morning. One client, a former Marine-turned-startup founder, once told me, "I don't wake up early because I like it. I do it because it's the only time I don't feel like I'm losing." There's something profound about that. In a world that constantly pulls us in 100 directions, those early hours become an act of resistance. A quiet refusal to be consumed, but even more than that, waking up early becomes a return to your origin, to the part of you that isn't reactive, isn't tired, isn't stressed, the part of you that remembers why you started. Because that's another thing we lose in the noise, our why, our reason for doing all of it. And when you lose your why, your work becomes just a task. Your relationships become just obligations. Your dreams become just checklists. But when you wake up before the demands come in, you reconnect with the deeper current, the one that flows beneath the surface of your life. You remember the goal isn't to get through the day. The goal is to live it fully. There's a term in psychology called attentional narrowing. It's what happens when we're stressed or overwhelmed. Our field of awareness shrinks. We miss nuance, we miss connection, we miss opportunity. But early in the morning, when the stress load is low, your attentional field widens. You see differently, you think differently. This is why some of your best ideas come not in meetings, but in the shower. Or on a walk, or yes, at 4 a.m. It's not because those moments are magical. It's because those are the only moments when your brain is given space. And let me say this clearly. Creativity requires space. Not just physical space, but temporal space. Emotional space, mental white space, waking up at 4 a.m. gives you all three, because no one needs you yet. No one is asking, no one is judging, no one is watching. You get to be you, unperformed, unfiltered, unhurried. That kind of space is rare, and rare things are valuable. This isn't just about work. It's not about becoming more efficient. It's about becoming more awake, more present in your own life. It's about aligning your external actions with your internal values. Because here's the truth. If you don't create your own rhythm, the world will impose one on you, and that rhythm will not be designed for your well-being. It will be designed for your compliance. That's a hard truth to swallow, but it's also the most liberating thing to realize. Because it means you have a choice, a real one. You don't have to overhaul your entire life overnight. You don't have to become a monk, but you can wake up an hour earlier tomorrow and start. And maybe, for the first time in a long time, you can hear yourself think. You can hear your own questions, not the ones fed to you by social media or marketing or even well-meaning mentors, but your questions. Who do I want to be? What do I actually value? What am I pretending not to know? These are questions that don't come easily. But they do come quietly. They come in the dark. They come when the noise is off and the stillness is on. And if you're brave enough to meet them, to sit with them, to write them down at 4:13 a.m. with your hands still cold and your coffee going lukewarm, you might just find answers that change your trajectory. That's what I've seen, not just in theory, but in practice. A young artist, blocked for years, began waking up at 4 every morning to paint before her job at the pharmacy. She said it wasn't about the art. It was about finally doing something before the day demanded her obedience. A widowed father, overwhelmed by grief and responsibility, began walking alone at 4:30 a.m. every morning. He said it was the only time he didn't feel lost. A college student battling depression and addiction started writing letters to his future self every morning before sunrise. A year later, he emailed me. He said, "I'm still here, and I think I finally want to be." These stories are not anomalies. They are human beings doing what human beings were made to do. Find clarity in chaos, meaning in silence, purpose in rhythm. And rhythm starts with one step, one decision, the decision to wake up, not just out of bed, but out of autopilot. Because here's what most of us don't realize. We've been living on default settings, waking when the alarm says, eating what's convenient, working until the calendar says stop, scrolling until our eyes burn, default. But your life is not default. Your values are not default. Your relationships, your energy, your sense of self, they don't thrive in default mode. They thrive in design mode, and design begins with intention. Waking up at 4 a.m. is an act of design. It says, this part of my life belongs to me, not to my job, not to my inbox, not to my followers. To me and what you choose to do with that hour, whether it's writing, running, reading, praying, sitting, it doesn't matter as much as the fact that you chose. Because that choice rewires your brain. That choice declares, I am no longer just reacting. I am creating. And when you live from creation instead of reaction, the quality of your life changes. You begin to build your day instead of endure it. You begin to lead, even if no one is following yet. You begin to wake not just early but fully. And isn't that what we're all really longing for? Not more hours, but deeper ones, not just success, but alignment, not just productivity, but presence. So if there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's that you don't have to wait for permission to live differently. You don't have to wait until your schedule clears or your life slows down or your motivation spikes. You just have to choose 1 hour, one early, quiet, sacred hour, and claim it, own it, protect it like your life depends on it. Because in some ways it does. It's not about the 4 a.m. club or the 5-step formula. It's about finally hearing your own voice in a world that's been too loud for too long. And when you do, you'll remember what you forgot. You'll remember what you were made for. You'll remember you were never supposed to sleepwalk through life. You were made to wake up every day, starting at 4 a.m., and if you do, the world may not change, but you will. And that changes everything.